in this video I'll show you how to test drive a component, a React component. We'll build a counter component, and we'll test drive the whole thing, and at the very end we'll look at the UI. So initially we won't look at the UI, and later on we'll take a look. So I'm on Code Sandbox. I'll just go to the tests tab. We won't look at the browser for now, and we'll start there. So let me create a components directory, and within this we want to create a counter component, and within this we'll have a few files. We'll have a index.jsx, we'll have a counter.spec.jsx, and this should be fine for now. So let's create the counter, or let's not create the counter because we want to test drive this. So let's start with the test. I do need some libraries to test, so I'll be using React testing library. So that would be under actually testing library / React. So this one. I'm not sure if Code Sandbox will pull in everything, but let's see. That is required, like basically that's required to run React tests, but let's see. So we're describing a counter. What this does is it renders the component, right? So we'll start with this, and what we'll do is we'll call render method or render function from the React testing library or testing library React, and to this we'll pass the counter component, and it's throwing errors. There is certainly something's broken, which might be fairly obvious, but let's go ahead with this. And what I will then try to do is I'll use the screen method, screen function from testing library again, and what I'll use the screen is to find the counter related components or counter related elements on the screen, basically on the page when we render it. So I'll try to find the button to increment, right? So I can do get by rule because it's going to be a button, and let's start with an increment button. So there's a single button, so it makes sense to use get by rule. We'll call it btn, and the next thing we'll do is we'll just expect btn to be in the I think this is where we start to see challenges, where expect, which is from just, doesn't have additional methods that are required to test our React function. So we want like to be in the document. That is not something we are seeing. So let me try adding. Let's see if that solves the problem. I don't know. Usually when you're using create React app or Next.js applications, such things are already configured for you. But let's import JSDOM, right? And let's import it here. So I'll do import testing library JSDOM. I don't think I'll import anything specifically. So to be in the document, yeah, that's available now. Now that like sort of this library is imported, it adds additional methods on the except function that we have, and we can run this. So we're getting something here. There's a problem. Counter is not defined, right? So now that we are test driving it, we need to define it, right? So I won't define it immediately, but I'll start by importing it, right? So again, I'm importing something that doesn't exist, but that's all right. So from the current directory, so I can do dot here. This complains again because there's nothing to import. This module, like the index.js, it doesn't export anything. So if I rerun the tests, I don't get any feedback, which is weird. I should get some feedback, but I guess that's not happening because this should be called JSX, not TSX. So okay, still not running for some reason, and it's not throwing any errors, but let's carry on. for a second, and let's define the counter component. Ideally, it should sort of continue throwing errors saying that there's no export as such. So yeah, okay, I think it's somehow stuck in a way that it's still expecting a tsx file. Yeah, here it's picking up tsx for some reason. So let me save this and then check. No, still picking up tsx. Let me refresh this and then see. Going back to test, yeah, now we are getting the right errors, right? So what it says is somewhere element type is invalid, expected a string, and so on. Is invalid, expected a string or a class function but got an object. To be honest, there shouldn't be anything. So if we do like console.log counter, I'm not sure if this will log something. Yeah, it does log an empty object. Okay, so yeah, in case it's importing nothing, then it's an empty object, so that's why it's throwing this error. So that's all right. Now what we'll do is we'll again like create the bare minimum. So I'll come over here, I'll create a counter function that returns just a fragment, right? This is valid JSX. It still throws this error because we are not exporting anything. So let me do like export default counter. Export default because here we are like importing a default from there. And as you see, we are now getting a very different and a very meaningful error. Unable to find an accessible element with a role button, right? So it's not able to find something with a role of button. So the next thing I want to do is satisfy this requirement. And what I'll do is rather than going to the final correct route, I'll sort of stumble to that path by doing some other things. So I'll create a div and put a role of button on it. It's still correct and it's still meeting the criteria. As you can see, like a thing with a button role is found and it's there in the document, so that's correct. But the thing is, like your tests were red, now they are green. Now you would want to refactor them, right? So that you complete the red green refactor cycle. Okay, so now let's do that. And like again, like this cycle will be continuous. You'll continue doing it every time you make changes, you reformat your code, or you improve your code or add features. So what I'll do is I'll change the div to a button. So now this role becomes redundant because button already has that, and ESLint is throwing that warning. Regardless, our test will still pass because either way it's able to find a button, right? So if I get rid of the role, still the tests pass. Cool. So this is good enough. This is our first test. Now the next test is on the counter. I would also like to see a count, a default value of the count, right? So counter has a default count, right? So and we can define that default count in the test, right? So we'll do the same steps. We'll render the counter first, then we will query the counter. So what I'm sort of thinking is initially we can have the button, or let's not do that. Let's not have the count on the button itself. So let the button say increment, because there would be another button called decrement, and then a count is a separate thing. So if I query by text, because I have an option of get by text, right? So there's an option to do a get by text, but the problem with this is initially I'll be able to query it, but the next time the value might change, right? So the value might go from 0 to 1 or 2 to 1 when I increment or decrement, right? So I would like to query by something else. So there is get by class, I think, or no, actually not, because React testing library is a library where you would rather do something in a more user-centric way rather than a implementation specific way. So there's nothing particular with regards to get by class or get by ID, right? So there are other methods though, like find by various things, right? So but still you don't find anything specific to query selector and all. So but there is one specific thing called I can do like get by test ID. right? So there is something called test ID, and this is something that is used when you're testing components. You add a data attribute called data-test-id, and it will find something, right? So let's add that here. So this is our button. It will be called increment, and next to it we'll have something called it can be a span or anything, and it will have a data test ID. Let's call it count, and this span will have a default value of 0, right? Now that I have added two adjacent elements, let me wrap it in a fragment, or it can be a div or anything else, that's fine. Now coming back over here, right? So I'll query the button by test ID. So I'll search for count, right? And then I'll say expect button, again the same thing, right? So to be in the document. So if I run this, it says counter is not defined for some reason. Okay, I've spelled it wrong, so that's why. So yeah, you see, like it's able to find count on the screen. If I misname it, you see, like it's not able to find something with the data test ID of count. It's able to find count, which you see here, like it's printing the HTML, rendered HTML, but it's not able to find something without the T, which is correct. So I'll make it T again, and the tests are passing. Now we have a button and we have a span that renders the count. Okay, so now this test alone isn't enough, right? Because we want to check the default count is something, right? So here what we have done is we have set the default count to 0. So we'll add that condition. So we'll add another test here saying that expect button to have content, text content as 0, right? So you see it has like text content can be a text value, a string value, or a regex. Reason being, like all the DOM nodes have textual content only within them. There can't be numbers within them. So if I do 0, it might pass, but I'll still get a squiggly line if I'm using TSX instead of JSX. So it's better to use strings. And you see the test is passing. Now just to make sure that this is really passing and it's not a flaky test, let me change it to 2, and then you'll see a warning saying that I expected 2 but the value was 0, right? So that means it's passing. So this is our second test, it's passing as well. Now let's test the feature where you click on the button and it increments the count, right? So it increments the count when increment button is clicked, right? Straightforward enough. So again, we'll have to do certain setup related things. So we have to render the component and we'll have to query the button. So let me do those two things. I'll just copy those 2 lines from above. Now I have the button and I want to click on the button, and then I'll sort of do the expectation where I say that okay, by the way, the count shouldn't be called button, so let me replace this with count, or let me just do a rename and call it count, right? So it should be called count here. It was the count, here it's a button. So when I click on the button, or let me just do that first, fire event dot click. So I'm firing a event of type click on the button, right? So this will click on the button, and then let me also, when I query the button at this time, let me also query the count as well, the span that has the count value. So now I have the button, now I have the count, and if I expect it to be 0, that would be a wrong expectation, right? Because I've now clicked on the button, should its value be 1 or 0, right? So ideally it should, like when you click on the increment button, it should be 1, but we haven't added the code yet, right? So if I go to my index.js, there's no such code to make sure that when you click on the button, the count here is incremented. So let's add that code. It's time to do that and make the tests pass. So what I'll do is I'll add a method here, and to add a method, I'll convert this into curly braces, and then I'll return this JSX, so that above this I can add a method called onClick. And what happens on this onClick is we get an event, or what we can do is rather we can query. So we can do document.query selector, and we'll query by data test id is equal to count, and then we will get its text content. We'll or let's save it for now in as a count. Then and also let's save this as a reference before that. So let's query count element, we have it here, and then we'll get the count just by doing count and count element, count element dot text content, and then we will update this value, right? So by default this value, like we discussed earlier, will be a string value, so we'll convert it into a number. Now what we'll do is we'll reset the count text content to be equal to count plus 1, right? So we are basically taking the existing value that is there in the count element, which is here 0, converting it to a number. So instead of a 0 string, it's a 0 number, and then incrementing it and then setting it back here. Instead of 0, it will be 1, right? So now we want to attach this function to this button as an event listener. So I'll say, like, whenever I do a on click, just call this function above, right? So we can also call it increment, which makes more sense. So use increment here, and as you see, the tests are still failing, right? So there's something off. So let's try to figure that out, right? So or yeah, it's still failing. Yeah, it's still failing. We have did we click? Yeah, we did click on it. So we're doing a fire button, click on the button, and we are expecting count to have text content of 1. Okay, so let's see what's missing. So on button click, when we are clicking on increment, we are querying this thing. So let's see if this is something we are getting correctly, right? So if we are getting the element correctly, so yeah, we're getting a null. So I'm wondering if this is if you are getting the right element or not. So if I run this, yeah, we're getting null a few times, so that means this might not be correct. So let me do one change. Let me add quotes around. Oh, okay. So the problem is I haven't closed this brace here. So if I do this now, let's see, save, rerun this. Yeah, tests are passing now, and you can see that this element is logged, so I can get rid of console log. So tests are passing now, and increment is working. So what I can do is I can also call it again, click on the button again, and this time I'll expect it to be 2, which is again happening. So if I expect it to be 3, which is incorrect assumption, just to see if our tests are passing, it should throw an error that it's actually 2 and you are expecting 3, which is good, like it's working as expected. So as we can see right now, we have just going through the 3 tests that we have a counter, which is basically a button. It's present on the document. We have a count which shows the current count. By default it's 0, and when we click on the button, the count increases. So every time we click it, it increases by 1. So far our tests are good, but maybe as soon as you raise a pull request, your sort of peer comes in and sort of says, hey, let's not query the DOM and change the values manually, let's just use state instead. So this would be an opportunity to refactor the code, and the way we will do it is have the tests running on the side and just make the changes, right? So let me start by introducing some state. So I'll use state here. The default value would be 0, right? So I'll say this is my count, and there is this method called setCount. Now increment function, I still need it, so I'll comment out this code, and as soon as I comment it out and rerun the test, or the test actually run automatically, and you see like the tests start failing. So this is giving me feedback that hey, what I am doing might not be correct, right? Or it's in progress, so eventually it will be correct. So within increment, what I want to do is I want to do just set count take the existing count and increment it by 1. So this alone isn't sufficient at this point, because what we are doing is we are not updating the DOM here, and we are not printing the count value anywhere. So even if we are incrementing the count correctly, when we click on the button, it's not printing on the screen anywhere. So that's the problem. So we need to replace this 0 with count. So as you see, all the tests are passing, so I can get rid of this reference code from earlier. So with this, we have made sure that the tests are passing. We can quickly also add the decrement button. So let me copy this whole thing over, right? And decrements the count when decrement button is clicked. Ideally, you should avoid copy pasting, because that way you don't refactor your code. But just for the sake of the video, and given that the complexity is very low here, we can just do that. So now we are running into a problem, right? Like where we have multiple buttons, or where we will eventually have multiple buttons. So when I get by role, I might query the first button, which is the increment button, which comes before decrement. So this might be a problem. So what I want to do is I want to refactor it to use test IDs for buttons as well, rather than query by role. There is something I can use. So instead of let me demonstrate it here. So screen, I can say query all by label, by role. I can certainly do this, but the thing is, how do I know if it's the first button or second button? In certain cases, I might know it, because I just have added the two buttons, right? So I'm pretty sure. The other way is to use test IDs. It's our choice. Given that we have already used test ID, so let me not do it. We have demonstrated test ID already there. So let me use query selector all, query by all by role, and then choose the second item, right? So let me do get all by role, and then the button would be the first item. So not this, the second item. So first index, right? So and let me call it decrement button instead, right? So let's replace all the references. And yeah, so far what it's complaining is that unable to fire click event, please provide a DOM element, because we don't have the second button on the in the component as of now, right? So that's a valid complaint. And before we get to the implementation, let me also make the amendments to the test. So by default the state is 0. So the first time I click it, it should be -1, and the second time I click it should be -2. So we can like later on add adjustments that, like when it's 0, disable the button and so on. But for now, like we are not creating that full implementation. It's just for testing purposes. So now that the test is failing, let me do the minimum. Let me copy this. Let me remove the on click for now and just rename this to decrement. So it says found multiple elements with role button, right? So I was hoping this might not be an error. Oh, okay. So it suggests that we use get all by text, or yeah. So now at this point, wasn't aware of this, but it recommends not using get all by role. So instead it says suggests get all by text. So instead, let me change this quickly. So I'll say get by text, right? So get by text, and the text on the button is decrement. Okay, so hopefully this doesn't throw errors. Okay, it's also when okay, I realize what the problem would be, so let me revert it quickly. So let me bring back get all by role. So it might be failing because we queried the button earlier here in the first test, because it's throwing renders the component, right? So there the test is failing. So here, even though I'm doing get by role, but there are actually multiple buttons, right? So I can say like get all by role and then query the 0th index. Now other tests are failing, right? So I can do the same thing here as well. So let me just copy paste this. I think now everything hopefully should be fine. Yeah. Okay, so If you have multiple roles, same roles within a component, always use get all or find all or query all rather than get by role or get by text, right? So that way you are specific that which index of that element or role or whatever it is you're looking for. Okay, so we are at this point where we have found the button, we have found the count in the element, we have triggered the decrease button, and we are expecting it to be -1, but it's still 0. Reason being, we haven't added the on click, right? And it will fail in both the cases, right? Like every time we click it, it's expecting it to decrement by 1, but it's not happening. So let me define the const decrement, which will basically just do set count, take the existing count and decrement it by 1, -1, and we'll set it up here. So on click decrement, right? So if I save this, you see the tests are passing. Just to validate, like if I assume that the first click should decrement by 2, then obviously that doesn't work, and it complains that you expected -2, but it's actually -1 because we subtracted 0 by 1. So that's cool. This test is also failing, passing. Other than that, we can also test one more specific condition, because we have a default count, right? So I think 0 is fine, like testing for 0 is fine, but what if our component takes in a prop, right? So we can call it count, and by default it sort of it's either just a second. So we can pass it here, right? So or let's not call it count, it's conflicting, so we'll call it default count, right? So we'll just use this property, and those default value could be, or let's not do it like this, so let's just do default count or 0, right? So we can now pass a default count, right? So now we want to check has a default count. In case I'm not passing it anything, it's 0, and if I render it again, right, this time why does it complain? Okay, we already have count, so let's do let here instead and do count here, and this time let me pass default count being 4 or 5, right? This test should fail, although like I think like there are other errors. Okay, so we are rendering this once, and then we are not cleaning it up. So this is why you would want to render you wouldn't want to render in the same test. So let me put it in a different test. So it uses default count value or prop to set the default count, right? So and we'll just paste in what we copied earlier. Now because count isn't being updated, the values, I can sort of change it back to const, and this time if I set it to 0, it will fail because I'm passing a default count of 5. If I go over here, I set it to 5, then obviously it should pass. So as you have seen, we have tested the button, various variations of the button, various events on the button, using React, using testing library React, and we built the component here in this file, but we didn't go to the browser once, right? So obviously theming and all is required, but that can come in later. Like that is a visual part, but when you are writing the implementation, you can test drive the whole implementation without going to the browser. This keeps your API clean. This makes sure that you are focusing on the implementation rather than focusing on how the component looks. At times it does make sense to prioritize it the other way around. But now let's look at it in the browser. So currently it's not rendered in the browser, so let's add it to app.js. So let me get rid of these lines and instead render the counter. So counter is not imported, so let's import it. So immediately I see increment decrement, right? So seems to be working just fine. And let's also render one more with the default count of say 10. Let's add a br in between just so it's easy to read. Yeah, it starts at 10, increment and so on, right? So yeah, that's pretty much it. This is how you test a very basic React component. This doesn't have any side effects besides increment decrement, which is isolated to the component, nothing that is external, and probably that's something we'll take a look at in the next video. Yeah, thanks for now.